Good morning from Washington, D.C. My name is Imad Harb, and I am the Director of Research at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Welcome to our webinar titled Lebanon After the Beirut Explosion, Overcoming Multiple Crises. It has been 15 days since the Beirut explosion on August 4th, that has really devastated the port area and devastated basically large parts of Beirut. About more than 200 people have died. Many are still missing. 300,000 have been made homeless. 6,000 are in hospitals or injured. And basically the country is really reeling from this explosion at the port of Beirut. The Beirut governor, Marwan Aboud, estimated the economic damage as anywhere between 10 and $15 billion, and this is basically an initial estimate. In addition to the physical damage that the explosion has caused, it also added some really serious political, economic, and social issues and security issues to the discussion about Lebanon. Where is Lebanon going, so to speak? The international community is trying to help, and yet the international community cannot really, so far, trust the Lebanese government to really do the right thing by the Lebanese people. So many questions really are basically posed by this very calamitous event. And many questions, general questions that we will try in this panel to answer is how will Lebanon overcome these multiple crises that it faces? Is the Lebanese political system capable of serious reform? What strategies could resolve the deep deficits in the political system? How can the economy be revitalized? And how reconstruction of the Port of Beirut and its surrounding areas be achieved? What are the mechanisms that could address Lebanon's social problems and dislocations? Today, we at Arab Center are honored to host this webinar on Lebanon. We have a stellar panel of experts, analysts, and activists who will illuminate for us some current issues and look forward at what can be expected, if possible, in a future Lebanon. I will introduce them and then pose some questions to each one of them. That person to whom the question is posed will answer in about 4 to 5 minutes. I'm trying to get two sets of questions. One that will deal with the current situation, and another set that will deal with, okay, what is to be expected about the different issues. Members of the audience are welcome also to participate in sending questions. You can send your question via the Q&A feature on the Zoom page in front of you, or you can send questions to events@arabcenterdc.org. I will introduce the panelists in this order and ask them the questions in the order in which I will introduce them. First, we have Mona Fawaz. She is a professor of urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut, and definitely very, very involved today in what's going on. Patricia Karam is a regional director of the Middle East and North Africa Division in the International Republican Institute. Joseph Bahout, who is a non-resident scholar at the Middle East program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he is the incoming director of the Issam Fares Institute at the American University of Beirut. This is something we all are looking forward to. Sarah Liafi is a public policy consultant and political activist. And Alia Moubayed is an economist specializing in the MENA region. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us. First, I'd like to start with Mona by asking her one of those really very, very funny questions, strange questions, that is. What elements of failure in the Lebanese political system has the Beirut explosion really exposed?
All right, so first, thank you for having me, and thank you for this question. I think that if you look at the explosion, what you see is a failure on every level. You see a failure at the political level, in the sense that trying to respond, to address the issues is 2 weeks after the event. You see that no one is able to actually put in place a convincing system to even either examine or respond to the crisis. I think that you also see the extent to which the country is unable to govern itself, both internally and externally. You get the French president walking on the street, being welcomed as a hero by a population that's so desperate that it's even asking for the French mandate to come back. And on the other hand, you see the local actors here scrambling, unable to respond to issues. Of course, if you look a little bit back, you have to ask the big questions. How can it be that so much explosives can be stored in the port for 6 years, right in the middle of a residential neighborhood, right? Because for those of us who know Beirut, the city grew historically around its port, and the neighborhoods, the residential neighborhoods that existed around this port are in immediate proximity. So that someone would think about storing so many tons of explosives in the middle of a residential neighborhood, that they would drag for so long, that no one would respond, neither the security of the port, nor the judicial system, nor the political class. No one even managed to feel the urgency of removing these explosives. So I think that however way you look, you feel that the explosion has created a huge, has exposed huge problems in the country. And finally, living here, it's also showed the extent to which sectarianism is still entrenched in society. The explosion has been an excuse to reinvigorate a lot of the fingers pointing at each other within society and among the political actors. And as much as there is solidarity and beautiful energy among youth coming to the neighborhoods trying to contribute, you also see threats, wishes that it happened on somebody else, accusations that someone else caused it, that tell us the extent to which this country is fragile, and its very existence, the possibility of the cohesion of its society, is actually fragile.
Okay, Patricia, I'd like to go to you next with a question on how has civil society and NGOs actually played a role in the previous protests, and how can civil society now play a role in what's going on in Lebanon?
Thank you, Imad, and thank you for having me with this distinguished panel. I wanted to answer your question. I think building up what Mona has said, I think it's important to underline in talking about civil society's role, the seriousness of the post-blast issue, or the seriousness of the issue, having to do with sort of deeper causes and everything linked with Lebanon's history of conflict, the warlords who hold power, the dysfunctional political systems, and parasitic patrons who have profiteered and depleted sort of national resources, effectively bankrupting the country. So ongoing developments. So to talk about civil society, I just want to frame it in terms of ongoing developments, which I feel are all about self-preservation and continued corruption. So the government to begin with, the government of the Prime Minister stepped down as an act of self-preservation. Lebanese politicians, once again, as Mona pointed out, are determined to escape the blame for a disaster of their own making, also rejecting an international investigation. So in this context where we're asking, and those who are being asked to reform are, in a sense, those who are responsible for, those who are to blame. The political class is buying time. And so Lebanon is somewhat back where it starts, in my view, in October, as the kleptocrats and its patrons, will have in effect ridden a revolution, an economic crisis, a pandemic, and now an explosion in such a way as to become even more powerful while robbing the victims of accountability and justice. And I know we'll talk about what next in the next round of questions. But one thing to keep in mind, so how has the role of civil society sort of changed, or how has civil society responded in this context? I think that what's important to note is that this contestation, which began in October between sort of this kleptocracy and an opposition on the street, has taken on more of an absolutist character in calling for an overhaul of this ruling system with the catastrophe. And now protesters are accusing governing elites not just of having impoverished them, you know, with the Ponzi scheme that I'm sure Alia will talk about, that has caused economic ruin, but also of criminal negligence for the explosion. So at the same time, overhaul has become sort of a signifier for disarming the Hezbollah, whose capture of the state has been viewed as being legitimized by the kleptocracy. And this was embodied by these public hangings in the streets, which may indicate there's a positive moment there, or there's a political moment with potential. But, and this also needs to be reflected in international policies, which I'm sure we'll also get to. The question today, so civil society and NGOs have played, sorry, from my perspective, an important role, and others can talk about this because they're on the ground, but have not been unified, the key thing, for a number of inherent reasons that have to do with sort of capacity issues that plague them, and the fact that oftentimes Lebanese are not in tune, are more in tune with individual loyalties. They've also, this opposition that has mostly consisted of sort of civil society groups, have also, and youth groups and unions and professional associations, have also been systematically sort of denied the right to unify by detractors who have used namely two methods. One, polluting the scene by injecting it with outfits that seek to deflect from their mission and purpose, and diluting their demands by introducing all sorts of red lines. That said, there are a number of independent parties that have been created in recent years who participated in the protest and who are having who have a growing base of dissatisfied voters. There is also, as I mentioned, independent student and youth groups working with labor movements and student labor coalitions growing as nodes sort of resistance. The question is, however, one, given the existing balance of power, the protest movement today, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself, Imad, cannot force the kind of non-violent radical transformation it wants. And it sort of, in my view, needs to play more of the long game, focusing on using this moment and future elections, possibly more opportunistically, to enable new actors to gain political power more progressively. In particular, this sort of movement or opposition, in my view, again, needs to build more of an organizational structure, more of the get out the vote apparatuses of established groups who excel at taking advantage of Lebanon's electoral system and laws, and rely on sort of deep-seated sort of networks to distribute resources, healthcare, employment, and build support. So opposition actors will need to create a strategy, a platform, and produce leaders. There are efforts that also need to be made to reverse kind of an evacuation that is happening and jumpstart some life in neighborhoods. As we see certain interests sort of taking advantage of the reconstruction. And again, rumors are abounding today about developers approaching inhabitants to leave. So here, the aftermath of the blast has also led, and that's relevant to the reconstruction, the emergence and the opposition, the emergence of citizen-led responses and solidarity networks that are providing aid to each other, whether food, shelter, cleaning, which is emerging in stark contrast to a government who is nowhere to be seen. And so in the absence of effective public agencies and sort of well-coordinated state efforts, trust in a post-disaster recovery needs to be more invested in people and empowering sort of the residents to restore life. So all that to say that in some ways, Lebanon, and I know this is a little bit idealistic, needs a sort of new social compact. And for this, it needs a new system and to turn a new leaf, but not to turn the page. I think change can only happen, and I'll finish, if it comes from within, and it needs to involve dealing with both ongoing, unresolved, and unaddressed legacies of abuse. So I think now one needs to think about how the Lebanese can imagine a future that's different, and that's sovereign, inclusive, and prosperous.
Thank you, Patricia. Mona, maybe later on after the first round, maybe you can add to what Patricia, because you are on the ground there, and we were offline talking about that. I want to go to Joe. Joe, it's what degree does Hezbollah have? What degree of control does Hezbollah have really over the Lebanese state or the Lebanese institutions? Are we really to understand that without Hezbollah and without Hezbollah's acceptance of whatever change that needs to be done, change cannot come?
Okay, this is the easy question, of course. I'll answer it in a second, but just let me throw my 2 cents at your preliminary question first, and give my impressions, at least for someone who have been abroad for a while and just came back to Lebanon. When you said, what does this blast or incident or accident or catastrophe show or underline, what kind of shortcomings or deficits? I would say very easily all of them, and all of them, not only the state's ones, but also probably the society's one, and we'll talk about it a bit later. I would say, I would like to use a kind of impressionistic language by saying that this blast was at both the conflation and the condensation of everything we've been suffering from and of in Lebanon for decades and the last years, and also the metaphor of everything that is not going well in this country, to be prudent. It's the metaphor first of, I mean, it was the condensated metaphor of the utmost negligence of public authorities, not only the government, the state, and etc., but all of them before the blast, during the blast, or during the incident and after the blast. Everything, every inch of what happened or did not happen was an illustration of what is not working in this country. I mean, I'm putting aside the macro political issues, even small issues like, for example, I'm taking one example, the firefighters' leadership, who sends a cohort of men to a certain death just because they didn't want to say there is something dangerous in this depot. I mean, this is something which is really directly criminal. I mean, even though, I mean, without entering even in the accusation or the inquiry about what was exactly there and etc., everybody knew that this was going to explode at some point. You don't send 20 to 30 guys, youngsters, to die certainly on the site of the explosion. This is something I think that goes well beyond or beneath what is political. We are completely in something that is properly barbaric. The second metaphor that it showed is the depth of the defiance between every citizen, the state, government, elites, and etc. on the other. When I was saying, the mere fact that you had this kind of hot, warm welcoming to Emmanuel Macron in the city of Beirut was also the reflection of the frustration by Lebanese that they can't even talk to their leaders, not even insult their leaders physically, directly, because they are not even daring to go down to the site of the blast. I think this episode of the visit of Macron and then after was this kind of embodiment of the gap and the let's say the the enormous gap that now exists and that is widening between citizens and the state. The third metaphor, or the third metaphor of shortcoming, I would say, and I'm sorry if this will hurt maybe friends like Mona or others, is the shortcoming of civil society itself. Now, of course, we've seen a lot of very willingful and really, I mean, people who need to be saluted and encouraged, people who went down to the street in order to do early recovery work, early relief work, and etc. But at the same time, the level of questioning of accountability so far, maybe it will change, that civil society is holding its political structure to after this incident is to that day very disappointing. Yesterday I was on another webinar and Nasser Saidi said something which I completely share, and I think a lot of us here and elsewhere in the society are thinking the same thing. If after such a catastrophe nothing changes, I'm not maybe talking about the full toppling of the political structure, but something important that could change or should change. If nothing changes after such a thing, I think that we can really go towards full despair about any chance of seeing things change one day in this country. This was an event of high magnitude, of huge magnitude. And so far, I think, and I put myself into that, our reaction is too shy compared to the enormity of what happened. Now, let me turn to your question about Hezbollah. I mean, this is the most tricky political question and the simplest also, because the simple answer is to say, yes, Hezbollah is the absolute impediment to anything in the country, to any progress, to any reform, and etc. But once we have said that, we haven't said much, because this misses the very intrinsic and very incestuous kind of tie that Hezbollah has built with the political system and that the political system has willingly built with Hezbollah. Let's not hide behind anything here. I mean, I think we all know the situation in the country. Everybody was beneficiary in the past 20, 30 years of this kind of intricate, incestuous relation. Exactly the way that everybody was beneficiary and on the winning side of the kind of very tricky mafiotic relation between the Syrian tutelage in the country and the political elite, one that was inherited by Hezbollah. Now, the question is how to dismantle that, how to unpack that, how to unease that. And I think this is the very difficult question that is facing not only civil society, but also political forces. We will come back to Hezbollah and etc. But Alia, Mona, probably the others know very well and probably better than me that when you unpack, for example, on the economic side, the complex of the problems that we are facing financially, you said the Ponzi scheme, the rentier economy of this country, the kind of political economy upon which we have rebuilt the country after the war. Frankly, I mean, without being political here, but Hezbollah is one among many other problematic actors and factors. So it's easy to put everything there, but I'm not sure that once I mean, let's assume today that Hezbollah evaporates. I don't think that the Ponzi scheme will disappear. I don't think that the electricity conundrum will be solved. I don't think that I will find my money back again in the banking account. Probably the corrupt political class will be more free-handed on certain issues. Probably it will be more impeded on certain issues. But structurally, I don't think that the governance problems and the public policy problems that we are suffering from will be completely solved. Of course, it's a problem. It is a geopolitical problem. It is a moral problem. But I don't think that it is a condition. It's a condition sine qua non, but it's a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition in order to put the country on tracks. I'll finish by saying that unfortunately, but this is really a bad and unfortunate coincidence of calendar. Yesterday, with the verdict of the International Tribunal, the tribunal, the special tribunal for Lebanon, something that the popular protest that started in October 17 has tried with difficulty to really turn and to put behind and to set the pace of the country on a new trail, meaning saying, and Mona knows it better than all of us, saying now we're fed up with the cleavage between 8 and 14 of March. We want to do something else. Unfortunately, history catches us up every time we try to go beyond this. Yesterday, the verdict and the aftermath of the verdict rejuvenated, refueled completely this cleavage. And this is why also I'm even more pessimistic on our ability to get over and to address our problems as they are, because once again, the political class, all compounded and all confused, will be tempted to put us again in the midst of this cleavage between 8 and 14 or other cleavages that really our generation and movement really sought to get over and to go beyond.
Thank you, Joe. I wanted to go back. I want to go back just a little bit, just a little comment on something that Patricia had said. I forgot to mention it earlier. I don't think she means public hangings. She means faux public hangings of effigies of politicians in Lebanon. Anyway, Sarah, I'd like to go to you to tell us about where is the protest movement today? You know, they came out in the hundreds of thousands in October, and then there was a whole bunch of attacks on them, discrediting them, pressures, and where are they today?
So the protest movement can be seen through various different mobilizations. There's the classical way of seeing us in Martyrs Square and chanting slogans and holding up signs and getting beaten up by the riot officers and the guards of the parliament. That is one way of seeing the protests. And another way of seeing the protests, which I find is exceptional, it's the way that the civilian population has come forth and taken the place of the state. And I believe this is the loudest form of protest because it won't attract any negative attention from the state, but they are actually filling the role of the state. We live in a country where people have donated their money and their belongings in the most dire economic and financial crises that we've ever witnessed as a modern world, while the state and the oligarchy were plotting ways to keep sharing the spoils of the rulership. That's a form of protest. We live in a country where people, children, youngsters, have volunteered themselves with their own brooms to clean our streets from the havoc wreaked by the explosion, whereas the politicians were sending real estate brokers to buy the destroyed building. I think that is a form of protest. We live in a country where people peacefully demonstrate for their most basic rights, whereas the regime sends their riot control units to shoot protesters with shredders and hunting bullets. People from the entire country have gone down to help the needy and the devastated and their devastated compatriots. People have donated blood, people have donated their services, people have opened their doors, while the authorities have stopped foreign and international help from saving the actual victims. That is a form of protest in the most existential and humanitarian way. People still actually cannot believe how there were survivors stuck under the rubble for days, and the authorities did absolutely nothing to help them. The families were mobilized down on the ground, begging and pleading for public institutions to help them save their loved ones from under the rubble. While on the other hand, every public institution, every security service in the country was mobilized just to find the guy who dared down take the picture of the president from the foreign ministry. So exactly as Joe said, and that is a word that I have been using on and on, this is no longer a protest for rights and for policy and for politics to clean up its act. This is an ethical and moral battle. This is an ethical and moral problem. It's not just a policy problem. And if we're just going to try to attempt to resolve those issues by discussing policy, we haven't even started actually answer the real question. The regime is not only lazy, the regime is not only corrupt, the regime is not only a failure, because I would like to remind everybody that corruption exists literally in every country around the world, but not every country doesn't have power plants and doesn't have infrastructure and actually has police forces hounding down protesters and actually not allowing them to enter hospitals. This regime is inherently felonious, lawless, and criminal. The parliament passed a state of emergency status 10 days after the explosion. 10 days. This proves that the decision was purely for political reasons and not for humanitarian reasons, because the oligarchy is scared of the mobilization of the people. But little do they know that the mobilization is not just Martyr Square, it is we are filling your role. All the destroyed areas were left to fend for themselves for 4 days before the actual security forces appeared in a serious way to help with crisis relief. 4 days. People whose loved ones were literally dying in hospitals were forced to stay at home in order to fend their ablated homes from any robbery or theft, while the security forces were literally nowhere to be found. That is not a policy issue. That is a moral issue. If still in any doubt, know that every single political party has officials stationed at the port. They are all responsible, and they will protect each other during any potential investigation possible. And if an investigation were to happen, as that is their very social contract. Wretched incompetence, awful corruption, a mafia and a militia in bed with each other, complete lack of transparency due to the militia's total control on the country's entire security apparatus and ports, all of them. It was actually shown that the ammonium nitrate was being in the port. Every single security service official, every single major political official knew exactly what was going on. And they tell you, "Ma andi salahiyat." They literally have said, the Prime Minister and the President of the Republic have both said, we don't have salahiyat. If you don't, as head of the hierarchy, the political hierarchy, who does? Who does? But today, irrevocably, the militia and the mafia are responsible for the explosion of August 4. That is internally speaking. And although I will not discount the very high chance, in order not to say anything statistically impossible, that this was an attack. But regardless of whether or not this was an attack, both are irrevocably responsible for the explosion of August 4. And only an independent international investigation would be initiated to explore all trails possible of possible culprits behind this awful explosion. And whether it was an attack or not, and again, I will change my name legally to cinnamon bun if this is not an attack, okay? But it's not a matter of investigation whether or not these guys are absolutely guilty, the entire political class. Each and every single leader and representative of the Lebanese political rulership has blood on his and her hands, especially that it was alleged that it might be more than just the Lebanese people and all the other foreign nationals who perished, because it was also proposed that part of the ammonium nitrate, and the reason why it was parked in the Port of Beirut for 6 years, the 2750 tons, apparently not all exploded, as per experts who looked visually that this is not 2,750 tons, where is the rest? I'm gonna posit a theory that I think it was a war machine for the neighboring country. So not only do you have Lebanese blood on your hands, but you have Syrian national blood on your hands, innocent of the next door country. And every single one of them must be brought in front of a criminal court and tried in an international court of justice. Just to tell you how silly just the way that our country is run. Recently, I don't know if any of you follow football, recently, Barcelona lost 8-2 in the Champions League. Barcelona, which was for a long time the top team, lost 8-2. The coach, Quique Setien, was sacked by the board of directors like that, just because he lost one game and humiliated them. And we have in Lebanon, half of the capital has been completely obliterated. I have explosives in the port of my capital, and they're all still sitting and saying, "La ma andi salahiyat, it's not up to me." I'm pretty sure that we can come forth as a board of directors and sack them. We can do that. And we are not foreigners to explosions. We are not foreigners to explosions, but I do not want, in the furthest fiber of my being, for this to be another day in the Middle East as per the international community. That is not another day in the Middle East. That is not another explosion in Beirut. This is the first explosion, not only in the country's contemporary history, but in the world's contemporary history of this size and this severity and this magnitude. This is a crime against humanity. And every single human being in this world actually has a say in this. This is a crime against humanity.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Alia, everything is it's politics and economics. I mean, the Lebanese Ponzi scheme, the economic problems. Could you please just get us into that? I know that it's very, very difficult to cover everything economic in Lebanon today, but give us a picture of what Lebanon is facing today.
Sure, thank you, Imad, and glad to join this wonderful team and friends. I mean, no doubt, I think the Lebanese economy today is reeling under a multitude of crises and shock, as your title rightly mentioned. For more than 18 months, but even before, all the indicators of a developing financial crisis and meltdown that completely unraveled in October and even in last summer, had all the symptoms of a combination of a debt crisis, a banking crisis, and the monetary crisis, which only came to confirm that the model, the economic and financial model that Lebanon and the Lebanese have been entertaining for the past few decades was completely unsustainable and too costly, both for its own people and to the world, for that matter, at least for those creditors that gave Lebanon money to sustain these Ponzi schemes. But I think the other crisis that even deepened further is obviously the Corona crisis that is touching every single aspect of Lebanese economy, particularly that the Lebanese economy relies a lot on sectors that have been severely affected. I mean, tourism, travel, commerce, and clearly these have, there has been a double down of the impact of the financial crisis through lockdown. And here you go, you have the cherry on top with this explosion that added both a humanitarian crisis, but also a disaster to manage in a situation where the state and the private sector and the citizens' finances are completely run down and unable to shoulder. And this is really the difference with past episodes of similar, let's say, quote-unquote warlike destruction, where despite everything, you still had a banking sector functioning, people's savings being able to use, some form of international donor community ready to come and provide funding through your state and through the banking sector. But what characterizes this situation and this multiplicity of crises is that this is happening against a complete financial meltdown and clearly stated. But I think building on what my colleague said is that what permeates, I think, and I mean, what permeates all these crises is exactly what was described as a complete sort of capture of the state by a irresponsible, kleptocratic, increasingly corrupt and clientelist political class. And I say increasingly because, I mean, I was a civil servant up to 1999. And I, over the last 21 years, I left in 99, I have seen as an outsider, as somebody who deals with the state where I sit in my job, a rapid deterioration in the quality of the state, of the quality of institution, and the level of competence, and a complete dilapidation in the capacity to formulate policy. And that explains why we fail to have right economic policies to manage our economy over the last decade. The fact that our response to the corona crisis was a bit very chaotic and deepened the malaise of the economy and of the people. And also sort of this clientelist corrupt web of managing the state that led to this criminal negligence, as we called it, and added this burden. So the crisis is the symptoms, are all the symptoms of this structural capture of the state, and where we have seen this, the cost of this capture basically deepening what I would call also these deficits of trust. And now I think that is a key problem for rebuilding the economy. There's a complete lack of trust between the citizens and the ability of the state to take them out of these crises. And this has been epitomized actually by the recent attempt by the previous government to come up with a plan and rally everybody around the plan for getting out of the financial crisis. And they were not able because there is a fundamental trust of a large part of the population, and particularly the protest movement, because they think that a large part of the political class and the web of its interest within the banking system is actually overshadowing a lot of the fiscal and monetary policies moving forward. There is a lack of accountability because no one wants to be responsible for why people's money that has been sitting in the banks, more than $120 billion of deposits, have been given to a central bank who has not provided financial audits and even went even further in sort of going against the money and credit law and lending to a state beyond what is allowed by the money and credit law because it is in bed with the politician. There's also this deficit of competence, because I can tell you for a fact that I think in the state today you have at least, you have no more, than 2 or 3 economists between the Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank of Lebanon, and the Ministry of Economy. I'm not only saying this, even the Minister of Economy of this government, when he came in, he said, how can I run a ministry without an economist in it? So you have this political class that voided the state from its ability to formulate and be forward-looking, whether on the economic side, on the social problem with all the unemployment and poverty levels that are worsening in the country, and even the foresight of a potential, basically, a problem brewing in the port. And finally, there is this deficit of policy coordination on the economic side, which was also very much starkly apparent to everybody, all the citizens, when you had a government trying to address a financial crisis, and you had its executive and the Ministry of Finance not agreeing with the central bank on how to go to the international community or to its creditor and have a common standing to what could basically best safeguard the interest of the economy and of the citizens and of the depositors. So you have a cumulative, basically, a set of deficits, some of whom we can cost and clearly address in terms of losses, whether at the central bank or in the banking system, in the north of $100 billion. But mostly, and what scares me moving ahead in the future, is really the deficit of trust in the ability of managing economic policies moving forward without credible, knowledgeable, and independent people taking forward the economic rescue package with an inclusive approach and participation by the civil society, but also trying to build confidence with an international community that have grown wary of helping an economy that is not, or governments that have been unable to undertake economic reforms.
Thank you, Alia. We appreciate it very much. I'd like now, I don't know how much of a second set I'm going to be able to pose of questions, that is. But Mona, could you please comment on the issue of the civil society? You were on the ground, and you can update us on that.
Sure. Look, I mean, I think we need to understand that what we're calling civil society is many, many people with very different capacities, doing a lot of very different work, actually, and really not agreeing with each other on a lot of things. So we have this idea that the political class is a mafia, and then there's people trying to move them. But we agree on the diagnosis, all of us. And you can hear here everyone presenting their perspective. We agree on almost everything. I may have felt at some point that I don't agree. The international community is just helping us. They're pulling us in their own directions. I don't trust them the same way they don't trust me. But in general, as a general diagnosis of how things work and where we are, there seems to be a consensus among people that basically what exploded on August 4 was the post-Civil War system that was put in place in the Taif Accords, and everything it set in place. Physically in the city, it's Solidaire that exploded, Beirut downtown. What they had built, what embodied that failed post-Civil War reconstruction exploded. And the big glass panes that we subsidized for so many years crashed on the ground. So we all agree on this. The problem is we don't have a theory of change. We don't really have a workable theory of change in politics. And that for me is devastating. And that's why somewhere in December, I frankly decided that I'm much better off working on the ground with various community groups to work on urban issues that I control super well, and where I can safeguard pieces and recover pieces of what is left. And we're seeing this right now in the neighborhoods that are devastated in a very nice way. So we're seeing civil society coming in, or what we're calling civil society, various groups, NGOs, organized neighborhood organizations, syndicates, coming in and really going into the neighborhood, surveying the damage, doing a lot of volunteer work. That includes universities. My colleagues at the American University from day zero were on the ground, seeing structural damages, trying to help people come back, and also verbally being able to denounce what is happening and what will come, because we have experience in recovery. We tried it in 1990, we tried it in 2006. We know what happens. We know that the vultures are around, that they're going to come get property before they even show up. We know that people will want to destroy heritage before they arrive, because we're watching them. The blast is just an intensity moment. Remember, in 1996, when Israel was shelling Lebanon, the private company Solidaire was destroying the buildings in in Beirut downtown, the heritage buildings that were still standing. So we know the recipe, we know each other really well. And so people are very active on these grounds, and they're bringing to the table their experience. I mean, I can tell you about contractors who, the day of the blast, were bringing their equipment to Gemmaizeh to start doing the recovery work, because they had done it in South Lebanon 10 years ago and they knew how to do it. So I think if we look at what civil society can offer today, I think there are a few things that are very hopeful. We offer the ability to some extent work together, to respond to some of the challenges in terms of immediate recovery, help, relief, in terms of putting in plans towards more inclusive economic systems or neighborhood level organizations. What we are able to have a unified voice that says that we disagree with the way our country is governed and we are run by a criminal class, and that what we saw with the explosion is actually a crime against us. They actually have gotten to the point where they're willing to kill us. But I don't think we have a theory of change that we can call the civil society's theory of change that people can really support. And that's why I feel that we are at a very difficult moment. And we look at the regional scale, and when you ask, you tell yourself, okay, what happens if the United States and Iran don't agree? Do we stay in the same conundrum? How can we move forward and put together a system if these big forces are not moved, and if we can't really formulate a unified ground? And frankly, so far, it is impossible to say that these various groups with their orientations are able to form a unified ground. So there are burgeoning political movements, some certainly more promising than others, some with beautiful statements in political papers. But so far, I would not be hopeful in thinking that a political alternative has emerged. And I'm not even hopeful that there's enough maturity, frankly, among the groups to actually work towards that. It's painful to say it for someone who's been, whose first protest was in 1990, to actually ask for the trial of the people who did the civil war. And then to stop Solidaire, right? To do it for the 100th time, to ask so Joseph, when you say there's not enough protests right now, I think we're freaking tired. I think we don't believe anyone is listening to us, neither the international community nor the local community. And so I guess we find hope in working together in thinking about the reconstruction of these neighborhoods, because maybe this will begin to rebuild something in us that can create an alternative. And maybe because it's easier to duck also and work at the level of a neighborhood than to look at the big picture around you, where you really don't have most of the answers.
Thanks, Mona. I believe it's a matter of state. It's a matter of the Lebanese state. The Lebanese state is absent. I mean, it has been absent for a long time, way before the explosion. And the problem is also the division among the different community groups. Honestly, I mean, this is something I wanted to ask Sarah about. Sarah, I mean, the protest movement, I mean, how comprehensive can we say this is a protest movement that really represents all of Lebanon? In other words, you know, are there certain groups that are more active than others? Are there groups that are looking at something differently than others? I mean, how is the Lebanese society? How is Lebanese society? How is organization around this kind of concept? How does it really coalesce on the ground?
So, does it represent all of Lebanon? Definitely not. But what it does represent is the many faces of the different Lebanese people who completely want to go against the current oligarchy.
Right.
And I always say this because I really find it fascinating. When we were demonstrating in Martyr Square, it seemed that what permeated the entire daily demonstrations was a very general anti-oligarchy feeling. But even within the Martyr Square, you would see that there were different squares within the Martyr Square. And I don't find that there's anything wrong with that. And if anything, I find it positive and fascinating. You literally had communists and capitalists shoulder to shoulder clamoring for the same thing. So everybody was literally asking for the same thing they did not want, which was the oligarchy. Nobody was making exceptions. Over the past few years, when we would be demonstrating, you would still find some people who were slightly sympathizing maybe with somebody by saying that they're not as responsible as other oligarchs. Like maybe this guy is not as bad as this guy. And I think for the very first time, I think in our contemporary history, we had people who were almost unequivocally saying that all of them must go. And I really believe the fact that we are joined by this sort of unanimous idea that we want them all gone, the oligarchs, is a very first essential step, because that was not there for 30 years. We were still defending, even, and I'm sure Mona knows better than anybody else, the struggle of Beirut Madinati was predominantly that there were a lot of Beirutis who were like, why are you starting with my oligarch? Yeah. Why not Nabatiya Madinati? Why not Junia Madinati? Why not Sherri Madinati? Why should it be Beirut? You're coming after Saad al-Hariri, so guess what? You're not getting my vote, even though I hate him. You know, like that was sort of very predominant. But now this is starting to actually take the back seat. But is there going to be a huge division within the Thawra when actual policies are going to have to be put in place? Of course, and I hope so, because we're not robots. Everybody has a completely different way of wanting to run different things, and I think that's the beauty of pluralism. But it's just no longer pluralism based on sectarian and oligarchic tendencies. So yes, the communists and the capitalists are definitely going to have different policies, but God damn it, they both hate those 7 oligarchs and they want them gone in order for them to come through with their own policies. And then, yeah, let's go vote on those policies. In a very healthy society, guess what? Let's say it boils down to communists versus capitalists. Let's make it as simple as Democrat and Republican, and then let's say it's the communists versus the capitalists. Guess what? Let's go friggin' vote. Let's vote. Let's make it a true political and policy battle. But today the battle is completely unfair. It's unfair because today when you go and you actually say what you want and you clamor for different rights that don't appeal to a certain majority that is armed, you get beaten up. You get physically beaten up in the streets. Physically beaten up. It's not like, hey, you might get bullied on social media. No, you will have broken bones. You will have a mutilated face if you do that. That's not fair. That's not fair. I'm more than happy to go against you politically. Get in the ring politically and let's argue with policy. But if you want to argue with beating me down, I'm pretty sure I would lose that battle against literally everybody. So it's not, so it's just, that last sentence, we're trying to even the battlefield. Let's even out the battlefield. And then that's it. Thank you.
I certainly hope that the battlefield is evened out faster than slower. Patricia, I want to ask you, I mean, what can the international community do regarding how to help civil society reorganize itself? If there is a role, anyway, if there is a role for the international community and that kind of respect itself, how can IRI or the National Democratic Institute or the United Nations, how can the international community really come in here and help?
Thank you, Imad. I think the role of the international community is critical. I mentioned before, like, we have a state that's been subverted. We've all talked about this kleptocratic class that's, controlled by outside patrons who is able to survive and leverage not just the revolution, but the economic collapse, a pandemic, and now it's trying to leverage the catastrophe. And using, to some extent, the benevolence, the response, the aid to its advantage to a certain extent. And I'd love to hear more from other panelists on the ground on what they're seeing in this regard. And I do recognize that the response has been somewhat limited to immediate aid to those who have suffered. And we've seen that like from a number of international actors, including France, the US, Australia, and others. But we also, it seems to me that even this aid is also being leveraged for political gain. And again, because this is the thoroughly corrupt society that we all talked about. And even as aid is flowing and reconstruction may be starting, it isn't always going to the people. So as an example, Gibran Bassil just appointed his aid, his aid as the aid czar to distribute aid. So I'd love to hear from other people how this is playing out on the ground. I think we need to look at what's in front of us, that this greed and dysfunction that make it imperative for certain changes to happen, but I think cosmetic changes will not do in some ways. I think we need some sort of a real transformation. The question is this government capable of more than cosmetic changes? So I do think that like the international community and the US should stick to a somewhat principled approach. I think that the Lebanon needs foreign assistance desperately, but more than that, it needs the reform that can counteract some of the corruption, nepotism, and impunity. And I think maybe the blast can be a wake-up call and be turned into some sort of an opportunity to exact leverage. And I think the international community should use it to condition aid to reform. So in my view, aid needs to be kind of tied to non-cosmetic reforms. And there is some realization among Lebanese, I think, and again, I'd love the take of others who are on the ground, that that assistance in general isn't going to continue to flow unless some serious reforms happen. And that to a certain extent, Hezbollah is hampering or playing a role in blocking these. I know that David Hale himself sort of stressed that the US is interested and willing to send aid, but there won't be any fundamental or further, I should say, help without some sort of fundamental reforms. So I also think that we can talk about that more. I think that the US should continue to pursue in particular the international investigation into the causes of the blast. As someone I know put it, logic mandates that you can't have bloodsuckers legislate anti-vampirism, if you will. So what does President Aoun want from the investigation? He wants to absolve the people he appointed from responsibility. So the international community should push for an independent, transparent investigation of the port explosion. This may have been an accident, but the accidental nature of it is indicative of the sort of criminal negligence by a political class that really doesn't care. And then the question I want to pose to the other panelists who are sort of working with civil society directly is, how does is there the possibility of building linkages between the international community and this civil society in ways that could be effective, knowing the boulders that are ahead?
Joe, I'd like you to just touch a little bit. We don't really have a whole lot of time left. We need to allow the audience to pose their questions, but what do you think of reform? I mean, we're talking about political reform. I mean, there is a huge movement now for, okay, we have to have an independent government with extra legal powers, new parliamentary elections. I hope new parliamentary elections, if they are held according to a new electoral law. I mean, what do you see of what's going to happen for the Lebanese state and its institutions to get out of this problem?
Once again, Imad, this is a very, very tricky and very huge question, because in fact, it's the fundamental question of the future of not only the Lebanese state, but the Lebanese polity at large. I mean, even the existence of the country, and the mere fact that some people are today raising the question of the survivability of Lebanon at the year that it is celebrating its 100th anniversary is not
Right.
is a very, let's say, morbid coincidence. Maybe to answer your question, I would like to come back to something Mona Fawaz has stated before. You know, this question of the theory of change. What is the theory of change? Which is something I always have hard times, struggling with. But I would say that in a country like Lebanon, that, without over-flagellating ourselves, has a history of pluralism, democracy, or at least public freedoms, if not democracy, compared at least to its regional environment. And this is the paradox. We always had a free environment in Lebanon and a vibrant society and pluralism, but we have never been able to organize a real civil society in the Habermasian sense of the term. Okay, but this is a philosophical question that needs another session. But in a country like that, I think that the theory of change has to put three actors together. It is threefold. The state level, or not only the institutional level, but the elite level. And here, let's not forget that, for example, the National Pact, we like it or not, it's another question, is an intra-elitist pact. It was not a national pact in the real sense of the term. It was a kind of verbal contract or pledge between two men, Bashar al-Khoury and Riyad Salah, that were really elitist, and then it trickled down to the society. So it has to go at that level. The second partner of this theory of change is society. Is it civil or not? It's a huge question. You know, I've been working for 20 years or more, or let me say my work 20 years ago in Lebanon was very much revolving around this concept of civil society, al-mujtama al-madani, and communitarian society, al-mujtama. We often tend to confuse both in Lebanon and in the Arab world, and this is something I think we need to tackle very seriously in terms of conceptual reflection, but also in terms of active, or in praxis, if you want to say. So the second actor would be the civil society in a kind of bottom-up approach that would pressure, in a way, the political level. And the third actor, also, unfortunately, but this is the reality, and I agree with Mona when she is hesitant in qualifying international intervention, it is the international community. Lebanon is a country that is really overtly extraverted. It is very much reliant on the outside. Alia knows better than anyone that we almost import 80% of what we eat, read, use, breathe, and etc. So we are open to the world. We can't change that like that in a second. We need to work on this. We have a huge diaspora also that is fabricating part of our economic construct, the remittances. And also because of our structure and history, we are permeable to external intervention. So these are the three actors. Here comes, between brackets, the question of aid and conditionality, and is the French aid unconditional? Is it conditioned to what, and etc. So we have a threefold, let's say, construction for the theory of change. I think that civil society needs to pressure the upper level. You can't expect a change unless you really believe that you are in a 1789 French moment where you will decapitate the king, but I don't know who's the king and how we will decapitate it. Outside of that, you have to rely and bet on progressive change, so constant pressure on the upper level. However, with a very, let's say, cynical dialogue with the upper pressure, and also a cynical use of the external factor. Now, to do that, and this is the conundrum and the difficulty, and this is where I probably join all of you, and mainly Mona and Alia, with whom we already are in talks about that. To do that, you need to be organized as a society, be it civil or communitarian. Now, of course, what I'm saying is a cliche. We know that we need to organize, but I think that, and this is the paradox of Lebanon. If you compare it, for example, with Tunisia or elsewhere, I mean, Tunisia was a really authoritarian state for more than 4 or 5 decades, but all of a sudden it discovered that it had remnants of civil society. I mean, the women's movement was very strong. The workers' movement was very strong. Even Islamists of Ghanouchi type was very important in crafting this political pact that led Tunisia to where it is today. And I think that it is a relative success story, whereby in Lebanon, we had a huge private sector, private initiative, brilliant people, high level of education, but in fact, zero or almost zero civil society organization. We had parties, political parties, but that in fact were the reflection or the prolongation of the communitarian structure. So I think this is the deficit that we need to reflect upon. And the time that has passed since October to now is both long and short. I mean, it's long because it's enough to draw lessons. And here I'm really talking to people like Mona, Alia, Sarah, and others. It is long enough to draw the lessons, but it has been short enough also, or too short, in order to overcome the many problems, the economic configuration within which we are swimming, that is really difficult day to day, the regional situation that is very volatile, and etc. But I'll conclude by saying, and to come back to something Mona Fawaz was talking about, okay, fine. What will happen to Lebanon if there's no deal between Iran and the US? But what will happen to Lebanon if there's a deal between Iran and the US and Lebanon's people and civil society is not organized to reap this? It will be overimposed on us, like exactly the Taif agreement was overimposed on the Lebanese society, and Lebanon was handled to a regional tutelage in order to, or a mandate, in order to take care of it. Are we heading towards that? If we don't organize from now till next May or April, May, or next spring, my fear is that even though there is a deal between regional players that will maybe put the region on a peaceful track, once again, we will miss the train. So I think that time is of an essence here. Time is really of essence for us in the civil society. Time is something that is playing in the hand of the oligarchy, the kleptocracy, call it as you wish, because they have breathing space, they have enough resources to rejuvenate. And I think that we had enough time from October till at least the blast in the Beirut port, although of course we can find excuses, COVID, the economic collapse, and etc. But I think that we have to be really aware that we are not making proper use both of the time and also of our outstanding personal abilities. I know that people are brilliant, people are very promising, but every time you sit more than 5 of them, you are faced with unbelievable ego problem, not to say more than that. So I think that outside this threefold, let's say, construction for change, it is useless to try to think that the state will reform itself by itself. First of all, theoretically, the state is an impersonal construction. It cannot reform by itself. The society alone will not construct a para-state or a counterpower, because Lebanon is not that type of society. And the external factor is, of course, a help, but in Lebanon, it has always been also something that is overimposed on us if we don't exist by ourselves.
Thank you, Joe. Alia, a question for you on the Lebanese economy. I mean, there needs to be a reform of the economic system. I know this is really a big question, but where should it start? I mean, should it start with the monetary policy? Should it start with the economy itself, macroeconomics? What comes first?
Well, I think all of the above, and I think one has to be a little bit conscious that when you're in the middle of a crisis, you need to first attend to the immediate sort of needs in order to move ahead, and then think about the more structural transformation that are necessary to basically reconstruct the economic model. And I think from here, you can say that Lebanon has really in front of itself two scenarios, right? I mean, a scenario where it decides that, yes, this is an opportunity, I would say not the explosion, but the whole financial crisis, the meltdown, the impoverishment of people, to say that, okay, we acknowledge we are all culprits, we've benefited all of the system because clearly every Lebanese has been living above their means over the last decade and has benefited one way or another, more or less, and then come together and say, okay, let's overhaul the system. And this, given sort of the losses in the system, as I mentioned, is only possible technically and with the help of a large, basically, package of international support that has to come from outside, but that we, I mean, and all of us sitting here have been saying that this has to come to support a homegrown reform program designed, developed, and advocated for and by the Lebanese itself. And as Joe and Mona and everybody knows, I mean, there has been many economists working and suggesting to the government, even before the Sadr conference, and I was at the Sadr conference, and we've suggested, working with Mona on how to address the shortcomings of the Sadr approach. But since then, I mean, a lot of solutions have been advanced to have to look at what is needed to overhaul the system. But today we need an IMF program to support this sort of a program that rests first on lowering basically Lebanon's debt burden, without which it cannot grow. And we need growth, even more so after the explosion, in order to be able to bring people's livelihood. So we need to have a debt restructuring, a financial sector restructuring, but in parallel proceed with all the structural reforms that have been saddling the state finances. And at the same time, really sort of build a very strong, I mean, Patricia called it a social compact, but at the heart of which there should be really very sort of a proactive labor market, social policies that help to support people's return to employment even more after the blood. But that cannot happen without an international support, ideally under the IMF, and that is the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is really sort of going into the direction of a subsistence state, a state which only relies on humanitarian assistance in the order of a few hundred million, like what has been pledged last Sunday. But this is only a very minor fraction of what Lebanon needs. Lebanon's external financing needs, even before the blast, was around, even after the adjustments of lowering our imports, was around $6 to $7 billion a year. And now we are talking about a few hundred million. So getting into the subsistence scenario is very dangerous, because what we are seeing it does is that it pushes people to migrate, to leave. So we're having an erosion of our best human capital, existing and potential, but also a sort of a continued, basically, a capital flight, indirectly, that erodes your ability to recover your growth potential in the future and leaves you in this subsistence stage for decades to come. My fear is that, going back to what Joe was saying, is that even if we are to be stuck in this subsistence scenario for a while, your theory of change, bringing these three elements together, has to make this sort of low equilibrium status exploit the maximum out of it. And the only way I see it happen is by having civil society take part in the framing of economic policies, in the monitoring of aid, in the evaluation of development projects, and in basically shaping the agenda for reform and monitoring it and reporting on it. I don't see how you can maximize the benefit of the existing subsistence scenario without enforcing the tripartite basically change model or theory that you have put forward.
Okay, thanks, Alia. I think we are late to get to our audience questions. There is a question here from Marcus Hallinan, who really asks about internal crisis. Is Hezbollah, does Hezbollah have an internal crisis? Or are we talking about, will Hezbollah change? Does a leadership change, so to speak, within Hezbollah change that party from becoming, from being, basically an armed faction to a civilian political party in the Lebanese political system? Anyone can take that. Joe?
Look, the question of Hezbollah being in crisis has been almost accompanying Hezbollah since we know it exists, or at least since the end of the civil war, since '91. Just to remind the audience and the person who raised the question, the first real crisis that Hezbollah has faced, and this was a very deep crisis, was in '92, when it had to decide running or not for elections, the first legislative elections in '92. And this is where the first official split within Hezbollah occurred, with Subhi Tufaili, one of the founders of the party, leaving it and creating a rebellious movement that is still existing in the Bekaa. So, and then you had a crisis in something like 96 or something. A huge crisis occurred after the Israeli withdrawal in 2000, when the party also had to struggle internally and in a very silent manner, because we didn't know about it, should we go on in the resistance or should we turn inward towards Lebanon. And then the third crisis was the aftermath of 2005 and the assassination of Rafiq Hariri and the earthquake that this has created. So of course, today the crisis of Hezbollah is another one. It's maybe deeper, but the party is stronger, at least in terms of military structure, organization, indoctrination, and etc. Now you have a question that most specialists quarrel about or are divided about. Has the Syrian adventure of Hezbollah weakened it or strengthened it? This is something that is open. The jury is open. Even Israeli experts are divided about that. They don't know if the party has been enhanced in military capacity or, on the contrary, bled and weakened. I don't know personally. Now, whatever the description and the diagnosis, I think that I will be maybe cynical here. Hezbollah's crisis has to be put in comparison with Lebanon's crisis. I mean, I don't know which one is deeper or which one is more lethal today. Maybe Hezbollah is in crisis, but if I have to bet on the death, I mean, at least the agony rate or the agony pace of Hezbollah and the agony pace of the Lebanese political and economic system, I'm not sure who will win the race. Third, of course, Hezbollah is weakened, but Hezbollah is a regional actor also. Hezbollah is both weakened and strengthened by the regional volatility. Hezbollah is weakened because Iran is weakened, because the conflict with Israel is taking a different turn. It is weakened because there's no more Arab consensus about it. but at the same time, it could all of a sudden revert its weaknesses and transform them into a gain if there's a deal of some sort that is reached between Iran and the US. So betting on the crisis of Hezbollah is something that has always been in the air in Lebanon. It has never been a really winning bet because frankly and modestly, and let's be modest here, no one knows what's happening inside Hezbollah. It's a black box like any strongly Leninist. And the so-called experts or pundits that categorically tell you this is what's happening inside Hezbollah and etc. has always been proven wrong. So I think that what probably should be done is to understand the conundrum within which Hezbollah is today and try to address, maybe not Hezbollah, but to address this conundrum in a way that will, let us say, decrease the risks of potential violence in the country and also decrease the risk that if there is any chance of let's say, conflict resolution in the region, it is not once again done on at our expense. I think that not losing time, I'm not being pejorative here, but losing time in conjecture about how can we really judge the weakness and the crisis within Hezbollah in order to play on it. First of all, is something of really, it's like meteorological, let's say, conjecture, but also second, this assumes and supposes that we are stronger than Hezbollah in order to play on Hezbollah's weaknesses, which I don't think at all is the case.
Thank you. I really don't know who of you is knows most about this, but there's a question from Mohammed Shenawi from Voice of America about the investigation. The governor promised a 5-day investigation. It's been 15 days. What's happening with that investigation?
Can I take this?
Yes, ma'am.
So I just want to put something in perspective, okay? The ammonium nitrate explosions that have happened around the world, supposedly there are 47 that have happened over the course of the past 100 years. And there are 2 that stand out because there's videographic and photographic evidence of what happened. There's one in Toulouse in 2001, and then there's one in Texas in 2013. There's another one in Texas in 1947. I'm not going to talk about that one, although it was massive. Those 2 still have inconclusive investigations. And these 2 happened in developed countries with no open war and no open conflict, without any different foreign states constantly threatening to bombard them. And it was inconclusive. In fact, the closest investigation that came down in Toulouse and Texas both is that it was an attack. In their cases, Toulouse blamed it on one of their employees who died, who they said had Islamic fundamentalism ties, and that he's the one who most likely did it. In Texas, they actually offered a $50,000 ransom if somebody would come forth with any information. So that's just for Toulouse and Texas regarding explosion, which is much smaller than the one that happened and without the international difficulties. So if anybody says that we will come forth with investigation results within 5 days, I think they're talking out of their ear, to not say something else. And that is irrefutable. Now, with regards to details of the explosion, and I do want to talk about some of the details of the explosion, and I thank the person to have asked this. There are some irrefutable evidence that has already come forth that has not been picked up, not by the local media or the internet. Well, no, some local media did, but the majority of the local media and the international media did not pick up on. Okay, and so the story is already getting distorted. Let me just walk you through really quickly. First of all, the captain of the vessel. Do you know what's the cover story? The cover story is that there's a vessel that was transporting 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate that was on its way to Mozambique, had to make a pit stop in Beirut because the ship had technical problems. And because it could not sail again due to the technical problems, they decided to keep the ammonium nitrate in Beirut. That's the cover story. It was even published in newspapers 5 years ago. Turns out the captain, Boris Prokoshev, came on live national TV and says, that's not true. There was no technical fault. There was no technical problem in the vessel. And no, we were not forced to enter Port of Beirut because of a technical fault. Everyone wants us to believe that because that has been the current official narrative. If you can already shoot down something as simple as that, not to mention that the buyer turns out to be a fictitious buyer, not to mention that it was not agricultural grade ammonium nitrate, but it was ammonium nitrate that was purely made for explosives, that's called nitropryl. There are photographs of nitropryl which are designed to actually explode coal mines. All of these things, already you understand that the official narrative is desperately trying to hide something. So there are two things to think about. First of all, even if you had integrity, you can't come forth with any form of result to the investigation within 5 to 15 days. And second of all, already your narrative is flawed. Already your narrative is flawed. If you were to merely ask just a child about like, so apparently the ammonium nitrate was always destined for Beirut, and apparently it was meant to dock in Beirut. It is purely explosive materials, and there was like a tacit agreement between different people in power to keep this ammonium nitrate in Beirut. You already know it's not going to bode really well, right? And I would like to add insult to injury, that even the way that it was covered in the in Western media, okay, whether consciously or unconsciously, I don't understand. The Western media has also been complicit in wanting to hide the truth. Again, I don't know if it was conscious or unconscious. There was an article that was published in foreignpolicy.com on August 5th. That's one day after the explosion, not even 24 hours, meaning the bodies of the dead are still warm, okay? And I will quote, I have it here, I will quote what it said, okay? Tuesday's warehouse blast does not seem to have been a product of conflict or an act of deliberate violence. How dare you? This is not just bad journalism. This is criminal journalism. For you to actually have this level of unprofessionalism and insulting audacity to come to a conclusion of the third largest explosion to date in modern times means that this is not innocent. Shame on such journalism, but also shame on that official narrative that is circulating, which is an insult to everyone's intelligence. If that was merely an accident, somebody please explain to me why the different foreign ministers of the biggest superpowers are all in Beirut. Why are there ships docked right outside of Beirut's port if that was merely an accident? So I just wanted to, I want to mention, and I will, and maybe this is the last time I'll talk because I'm sure that there are other questions for other panelists, but I've seen a lot of questions from the expats asking, what can expats do to help? What can we do? Please bear in mind that this is not another day in the Middle East. I've said this earlier and I will say it again. That's not just another day. This is crime against humanity. The way that the international community, and I'm not talking about the governments, because the government have strategic interests, and even if Israel, whether or not was actually involved in this, we know will not see the light of day in any investigation. But there is the community, the human community of the world, the same people who mobilized for Darfur, the same community who mobilized for the famine in Somalia. Those same people are going to have to mobilize in order for the truth of this to come forth, because everybody from the local big guys to the international community that is complicit in the international governments that are complicit in trying to hide whether this was an accident or not, we're not relying on these people. This is a human case. We need the human beings to come together and bring forth the truth to light. Thank you.
Mona, this is a question for you. You basically know the pulse, so to speak, of at least Beirut. I'm sure you know the pulse of Lebanon as well. What is the possibility of getting rid of the confessional system? This is only in about 35 seconds. No, I'm just kidding.
I think it's a process. I think it's a process that started. I think October 2019 showed that there was a desire for people to move out of the political sectarian system. I think people increasingly understand that the political sectarian system is not something that people belong to just because they like it or because they were born like this, but because the state has operated for the last 100 years as a system that reproduces sectarian organizations. And that today, the reason why we have an army of more than 100,000 people is because we have to hire people at very low salaries and give them housing subsidies and coupons. And this hire has to come through the same sectarian lords that also hire the school teachers in our public schooling system and all the other institutions. I think people are beginning to realize that if we have to get out of this system, we have to get out of the clientelism that is roping so many people in, not necessarily because they like someone, but because they have no other choice to survive. Our rentier economy that Alia described so well has very much operated to reproduce this system. If I am hopeful about something, it's about the fact that if they lose their money now, perhaps we will begin to see people ready to imagine more readily other ways of organizing their lives and their economies. And there I have hope. I think people are oscillating and that is hopeful, but it's not something that you can remove in 1 second. It's something you build. And I'll just say this, when I got involved in Beirut Madinati very early on, which was this in 2015, in September 2015, when we came up with the idea. We were a group of 4 or 5 friends. We said political change will only happen from the bottom, and we have very little control over big things, but we can at least make a difference in what we know. Well, we've been volunteering work for so long, let's translate it into real political alternative that comes from the bottom and is to our scale. And I remember very clearly somewhere in the first month, we had started each one bringing people, and I walked in a room and I don't know how I was mentioning, and I said, who's married here a civil marriage? And it was really funny, but more than 2/3 of the people in the room had a civil marriage in that room. And that is to tell you that, like, when you begin to engage people on a platform that is non-sectarian, you begin to see that there are much more people that you don't know that who belong to this environment. And I think engaging people on panels like we're breathing the same dirty air, we're living in the same congested streets, our livelihoods are awful, brings people together. And I have genuine faith that urban-based movements, local electoral campaigns have enormous power in changing things. And that's why perhaps again, this blast will allow us to rebuild things from the bottom up on an urban-based collection of people, irrespective of sex.
Thank you, Mona. Patricia and Alia, I'd like to ask you, if possible, just in 1 minute, please comment on that hopeful note that Mona just gave us. Patricia first, 1 minute.
Unfortunately, I mean, I was hoping you'd end on that hopeful note because I see things a little bit more pessimistically. And while I do see, I mean, we haven't talked about the what next and the government formation and what things will look like, an election. I mean, Mona mentioned elections. I do think there is a danger that elections sort of, even if they happen sooner, which some people feel is an opportunity, will reinforce the stranglehold because of how pervasive corruption is. And while I'd love to believe that there is this kind of non-sectarian, and we do work in that direction with IRI in our program to encourage kind of horizontal-based linkages, I do think that oftentimes what you find in Lebanon is that people make exceptions for their leaders. So كلهم يعني كلهم doesn't always mean all are responsible. Sometimes my leader is less responsible than others. And so I worry that that elections, for example, today as a strategy or as a prize may reproduce the same kleptocratic class. But elections in the future, maybe there is the opportunity, like maybe there is, just to be positive, there needs to be, again, to echo what Mona had said, a sort of concerted effort to produce, even though it sounds trite, Joe, in some ways to produce leaders, strategies, policy agendas, tactics, And I do think that this is the only thing left for people to do, to develop, to network, to develop a vision, and to hope, to sow seeds and hope for the best in some ways.
Thank you, Alia.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot but agree. I think again on the economic and developmental issues, what we have seen is an amazing willingness of Lebanese, both inside and outside, going back to what the expats can do in sharing and providing their expertise and even sort of trying to educate the public and the policymakers, for that matter, on at least sort of the scale and the complexity of the economic and financial crisis that we have been going through, and we have seen the benefit of this work trickling into decision making to some extent, but not totally. And there are a lot of lessons learned on that. I think what we need to do is really to do that. When we talk about reform, we have to think about the supply side and the demand side. Today, the supply side is almost dysfunctional because, as we said, there is state capture by the politicians who are anti-reform because they are the antithesis of many of these reforms. The supply side is also muted because there are less and less people, but there are still a lot of people, but not enough to carry forward the agenda of reform from within the administration. So what we need to do is to help them, and going back to the tripartite, basically theory of change of Joe, is to work on the demand side. And this demand side of reform has to come with the help of the international community through, again, if I talk about the economic side, through a massive support to a lot of the organizations who are working on the economic and financial solutions, in raising awareness, in putting forward agendas, but also on the legal front in pushing ahead all the structural legal agenda of reform on conflict of interest, the procurement reform law and how it worked is supported by the international community to people in the administration, is a case in point that we should reinforce and champion. There are a lot of good examples, but we need to work on the demand side until we manage to build the change from within to take over the supply side.
Thank you, Alia. Thank you to the panelists. We really appreciate it. This was really a very, very nice panel. I appreciate your participation with us. I want to apologize to the people who sent questions. We couldn't get to their questions. We're basically out of time. Thank you, Mona. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Alia, very much. Thank you for all those of you who joined us for this event. We appreciate it. This event will be on ArabCenterWashingtonDC.org by tomorrow afternoon, recorded and reported on. And we appreciate it. And we hope that you join us for more events by Arab Center. Thanks very much for everybody, and have a very lovely day. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.